My name is Tanya, and you're here for the Positive Coping with Chronic Pain webinar. We're very glad you're here. I'll be moderating the webinar today, and our speaker is Joti Samra. This webinar is co-sponsored by the Canadian Pain Coalition and Pain BC, as well as ourselves, Canadian Institute for the Relief of Pain and Disability. And it's also been made possible through the support of a direct access program through the BC government. Just a few technical points. You should be able to hear the presentation through your computer speakers or through the conference call line if you dialed in. Please use the question box if you're having trouble with any hearing or what you can see on the screen, and I will respond to you as soon as I can and help you troubleshoot it. And also we'll collect questions through that same box for doing as a question and answer at the end of Dr. Samra's presentation. And then after the meeting, any questions that weren't answered in the allotted time will be posting on our blog, and the presentation will also be recorded and posted for free on our website, and you'll get an email with a link to that probably later this week. And my name is Tanya, and I'll be moderating. And then we also have Anne Gillespie, who works with me here, and she'll be helping collect questions. And our presenter today is Dr. Joti Samra, and she is an innovator in the area of psychological health and wellness. She develops strategies for coping with life's most common and difficult challenges, reaching beyond the clinic and classroom to spread powerful coping tools as widely as possible. She's a dynamic and engaging speaker, and she presents her work extensively at the invitation of organizations across Canada and the United States. She is the past president of the BC Psychological Association and chair of the BC Psychologically Healthy Workplace Collaborative. We're really excited to have her here with us today, and I will hand it over to you, Joti.
Great. Well, thank you, Tanya. Thank you for having me. One of the areas that I specialize in is, of course, workplace, kind of mental health, and I think you alluded to some of the things that I do in that capacity, but I've also had extensive experience working with individuals that have a range of chronic health issues and a range of different kind of chronic pain-related issues. So it had started at a Western office for a company a number of years ago working with what was exclusively a long-term disability population, so individuals that have been off work on disability for the average number of years off was 6.7 years, and presented with a range of kind of chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, back injury-related pain, chronic migraines. So I've got quite a bit of experience working with this population, and one of the things that really struck me when I started to do that work with that population was how, I mean, first of all, as we all know, how disabling these conditions can be, the extent of the impact that these conditions have on individuals' quality of life, and really the kind of lack of, I think, a real thorough understanding of interventions that work. And one of the things that one of the resources that I was involved in authoring that kind of came out of this, it was actually through Vancouver Coastal, or funded by Vancouver Coastal Health Authority, was a manual that I co-authored called Positive Coping with Health Conditions, and I've got the link to that here. And I just wanted to kind of just start out with that because I think pain and how we manage pain is not as well understood as it could be or should be. And what we really know is that comprehensive interventions that involve a strong focus on psychological interventions are hands down the best kind of treatment for chronic pain issues. So we'll just kind of start with that. What I wanted to do, there we go. What I wanted to do was talk a bit about the multifactorial nature of chronic pain, give you an overview of cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, models of treating chronic pain. That's one of the strongest evidence-based treatments. And then identify the key components of that for individuals with chronic pain conditions. And I realize we've got a very short period of time, and so I'm going to go for about half an hour and then make sure that we leave some time for questions. So what I'm going to do here is just kind of whet the palate for information in this area, and then I'm certainly happy to give you more resources that people can go to if they're interested in reading and learning more about this. I'd like to start out with a definition of health, which many of you may be familiar with from the World Health Organization, where health is defined as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And I really like this definition. I like that it includes a focus on mental and social well-being, and certainly when we think about pain, right, we often categorize that as being a physical health condition, and forget the other components. And both psychological kind of state, well-being, coping responses are key, as well as the social component. And one of the areas that often is impacted the most for individuals that are struggling with chronic pain issues is the social piece, because often they're not able to engage in the same kinds of activities, social activities that they may have done before, physical activities that often have a social component, or be able to even engage in just kind of regular day-to-day socializing in the same capacity because of limitations associated with the pain. But we know that separate from the pain issue, reducing social connection actually exacerbates the experience of pain. And one of the things to keep in mind is that the same part of the brain where we experience pain is the same part that we experience emotion state. So the two are so interconnected. And I'll have patients often say, well, you're a psychologist and you're seeing me, treating me, recommending these issues. So does that mean that this is all in my head? And I'll say, well, literally, pain is in your head, right? That's where we actually experience it, is in our brain. And what's important is that the part of our brain where we experience pain is also right near where we experience emotion state, so within our limbic system. And then it makes sense why there's such comorbidity between physical experiences of pain and then the emotional, psychological component. So one of the things that I want to talk about is something that's called supported self-management. And supported self-management is an approach that we're increasingly seeing come into the literature and models of dealing with chronic disease conditions. And it really is an approach to managing a chronic condition that is guided by the patient and supported by a healthcare provider. Okay, so one that really is patient-driven. And there's lots of evidence that supported self-management approaches are one of the best ways that individuals can manage really any chronic health condition. And I apply this model to talking about mental health conditions as well, so depression or anxiety, where the nature of those conditions is such that they come and go over periods of time and may wax and wane in terms of intensity at different periods depending on let's say the physical health condition that's contributing, life circumstances, and that really for patients to learn how to cope with pain conditions and prevent relapse or factors that may be unnecessarily exacerbating the pain becomes a really important way to approach chronic pain. And so there's three key features of supported self-management. One is that it's patient-driven. So guided by the individual, and the goal here really is to have the individual that's suffering be able to educate themselves and learn about what treatment works best for them. And it's complementary to ongoing care. So this isn't something where you would say somebody stops whatever other kind of treatment they're receiving from a medical perspective. It's something that's complementary to that. We know that these approaches are consistent with best practice guidelines that are coming out for a number of conditions, including arthritis and depression, and really are cost-effective in the sense that supported self-management approaches can be made available to individuals that are in early stages and really can be effective in preventing exacerbations or recurrences in cases where there's acute increases in pain. Now, what you really do is start by providing a self-management tool to the patient. So I've referenced here the CBT-oriented book that I've described, and I've got a link to it later. It's called Positive Coping with Health Conditions, and it is something that is intended to be a manual that someone can work through. It's grounded in cognitive behavioral therapy principles. it's evidence-based, and it's freely available. So you can go to the website and download a PDF version at no cost. For those of you that are working with this population, you can print it off, duplicate it freely. People can read it online. They can download sections by HTML, and there's some audio files that come along with that. But the basic part of the approach is to give some resources that an individual can read and learn about. The individual then learns and acquires evidence-based skills for a range of the kind of psychological, emotional components that come along with chronic pain based in CBT. And the role of the healthcare provider is to act as a coach. So to really help the individual work through key skills. The individual does not have to be an expert or specialize in CBT at all. So, I mean, you could do this without having any background in mental health or psychological health. The goal really is to encourage, support, and coach an individual to work through these kinds of skills on their own. And there's a number of advantages of supported self-management approaches in primary care. They extend the reach, they're guideline recommended, and you can see here kind of low cost, low risk, and really practical when we're thinking about primary care settings where healthcare providers may have very limited actual contact time with a patient. And the evidence does show that even very short time-limited patient contacts that may be as short as 10 minutes, right, in cases where family physicians are leading this kind of approach, are effective and really do make a difference in terms of patients' subjective experiences of pain. And there's 3 steps to supported self-manage. So first is you want to assess. Second is advise or give useful information to the patient, and then assist them as they go through the process. So I'd like to talk about these 3 steps. So first, from an assessment perspective, positive coping with health conditions has in it, in the kind of first section of the book, a short little screening tool. And this is one that's been developed by folks at St. Paul's Hospital here, and really just asks about a few key areas from a psychological perspective. And these are so important to ascertain for individuals that are dealing with pain issues. So you'll see here asking about stress, kind of low mood, anxiety, anger, and social support. These are the areas that we know end up getting impacted the most. And you may say, okay, so why administer a scale? And there's actually some value in having individuals answer these questions, write them down, and actually see where they fall. It can also provide an index for them to track over time how they're doing. And really there's a motivational component as well. And you think this is true for any of us, right? When we're stopping and being asked a question and then also having to kind of write it down, it makes us a little more accountable, and it may make some issues that we know are there but maybe haven't paid attention to a little more salient to actually see them written in front of us. It also gives useful information to a healthcare provider to be able to say, okay, what are some of the areas in which the patient that I'm working with is struggling, and it can help you know where to focus and hone in certain interventions. What you want to do when you're thinking about cognitive behavioral approaches, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about what those components look like, is first of all make sure that there aren't any medical contraindications that lead to, or activities that would lead to harm for the patient. And this is really important because the C part of CBT focuses on individuals' cognitions or thoughts, but the B part of the behavioral part is getting individuals reactivated. And often, understandably, there's a huge amount of fear and concern about doing things that will make things worse. And it's really important to go through and separate out activities that lead to increased pain versus activities that lead to increased harm. And this is a really, really important distinction for patients. And I think all too often this part isn't done. So what will happen is advice is given that will be to, say, okay, if something is making you feel worse, don't do it, right? Or pace yourself, for example. That kind of advice is given all the time. Now, that is good, useful advice if people are engaging in activities that are actually creating harm. So that's an important question to make sure that you're understanding and that patients are understanding. And I'll ask them just very simply to talk to their primary provider, which is often the family doc, and have them actually write out activities that make things worse from a harm perspective. This piece often takes a lot, I find, from a treatment perspective, can be a real big shift for patients to make. But it's really key before you kind of start other interventions to make sure that this is something that the patient is on board with. And I'll often describe pain as being like a sensitive fire alarm. And I'll use that metaphor when I'm talking with patients. And, I'll say, have you ever lived somewhere where, a fire alarm went off and there was no fire? And most of us, have had that experience at some point. And or people can relate to that very easily. And I'll say, so when pain is basically a signal. So think of it like a fire alarm, okay? And there's a function to that signal. The function is to let us know when there's some danger in our body, right? So a fire alarm goes off when there's a fire so that we can actually take some action to protect ourselves. Now, the problem with chronic pain is that we get the alarm going off that's signaling danger in the absence of danger. And like a sensitive fire alarm, so I'll sometimes give the example of living in university days in a dorm where a fire alarm went off all the time, and I would boil water and the fire alarm would go off. Boiling water, making toast, burning something would set off the alarm. And I'll say chronic pain is like that. So the fire alarm that goes off when you've burnt toast sounds the same, is just as loud, right? It goes off in the same kind of manner as it would if there was a real fire. Just like pain and the pain response and pain signals feel as if there is some danger that's happening. But as we know, if you live somewhere with a sensitive fire alarm, it isn't a sign of anything dangerous. And in fact, what you need to do then is continue to do what you're already doing and make the sound go away, right? And that's a metaphor I use with all patients that I end up seeing with chronic pain conditions. And I'll talk more about the cognitive piece, but really what you're doing is making some real shifts in the assumptions and beliefs that individuals have about the nature of their pain. Another question that you're wanting to kind of ascertain information on is an individual's activities of daily living. So, really take a look at individuals and say, okay, where is their activity at now? Compare that to their premorbid function, and is this consistent given the nature of the condition that individuals have? Is it what we would expect? And this, I'll say, sometimes is just kind of the common sense factor, right? And stopping and saying, well, does this make sense that the individual is or isn't able to do X, Y, or Z activities? And again, I say this because this often gets missed, and part of what I would do in the service that I used to work before with a chronic pain population is meet with all family docs that were seeing patients, and I would see individuals that were completely restricted in their activity. I mean, so restricted that it seemed, almost nonsensical given the nature of what was happening physically. Now, not because individuals wanted to be in that situation, not because they were, lazy or not doing their treatment or all of these other assumptions that people can sometimes make, but they truly were in huge degrees of pain. And when I would go back and try and put together the chronology of how that happened, it was a gradual process of deconditioning over time, which gets really difficult to step in and do something about if you're years into someone who's had a chronic pain condition. And if you start early on and start to pay attention to people that are, or pay attention to and intervene when individuals are overly restricting and getting them to be more activated at that stage, it's much more successful. You also want to take a look at individuals' reliance on active versus passive coping strategies, right? So active strategies are things like exercise, stretching, versus the passive coping ones, so rest and massage being the two most common, and also encouraging. We know what are much better coping strategies and more effective coping strategies are the ones that are active. And that often requires a cognitive shift as well, and certainly requires changes in behavioral function. And then asking about individuals' beliefs and thoughts around what has caused their pain, what the pain means, what they think they can and cannot do, what they think that'll look like over time. And this is, again, a really important question. So I'll often, say, so help me understand, how you've gotten to where you are. Help me understand what you know and understand about your health condition. What do you think this means in terms of what you will be able to do, could do, and when I'm hearing things that are black and white statements, all or nothing statements, I kind of, make a mental note to come back to that, because that becomes an important focus from a cognitive perspective. Okay, you then want to, your role is to give some advice to individuals about a comprehensive model of pain. And the CBT model I presented here, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but the Positive Coping with Health Conditions manual has a section that describes this CBT model. And that is something, although the manual is written for individuals that have a health condition, it is a really useful teaching tool. So I would encourage those of you that are interested in getting more information to just pull out sections of that or pull it up online and read more about the CBT model, because that can help you in terms of having kind of words and language for how you describe the model to patients. Now, very simply, what we know is that, and this is true for most situations and conditions, is they're multifactorial. So there is an interplay between our physiology, right? So we'll start there, because for individuals with chronic pain, the physical piece, right? So that's your physical health, how you feel. That's related to things that we do, right? And you often see significant withdrawal from social activities, reductions in social and occupational activities, reduced self-care behaviors. Sometimes situations play a role, right? Not always, but some of the time there may be some very clear activities or situations, emotional situations that are stressors that may exacerbate pain. Other times there aren't. Our thoughts are really important. So with chronic pain, you often see individuals engaging in kind of catastrophic thinking. So huge amounts of fear about what the trajectory of their pain condition will look like. Real overestimation of the probability of events happening. So, I'll hear things like, if I were to, let's say, if I were to go to a party and spend 3 hours standing up, I'd be in bed for weeks afterwards, right? So those kinds of statements, and what you're getting is this real overestimation and about the likelihood of something happening, or I won't be, you hear lots of I won't be able to, and then you can fill in the blanks. And often when individuals, we have to understand those statements come from fear, and huge amounts of fear about what their capacities are. And often when you get individuals to kind of slow down and go through and think about times they've been in certain situations, they'll realize that they actually have been able to tolerate often more situations than they've thought they could without it being as bad as they may feel. And then there's the emotional component as well. So with anxiety, worry and anxiety is a big component of chronic pain. Anger, right? Anger itself, anger at the health condition, anger at the situation, anger at the healthcare system for not being able to help better. I mean, those are real common emotion states. And then low mood. And you think for any of us, if we were to end up in a situation or situations where our activities were impacted significantly, we weren't doing what we normally like to do, we weren't able to socialize in the same way, that of course mood starts to get low. And what I'm doing is really just kind of normalizing that all of these things are connected. So when we feel a certain way, we act a certain way, we think a certain way, and we feel a certain way. And that really is the heart of this CBT model. When we look at a range of chronic health conditions, physical symptoms, pain, and limitations are associated with that. That, of course, increases stress level. And stress levels, so people, when I find if there's reactions to talking about the emotional part, right, and if there's a focus on the low mood or worry or anxiety, often walls will come up, and patients will sometimes say, well, why are we talking about that? I have a pain condition, it feels like you don't believe that I've got that, and it has nothing to do. Those 2 points are completely independent, and I will make sure that I do lots of qualification on this, because often the message, if it's not presented thoroughly, people will interpret it to mean that they don't have a physical health problem. And that is not at all the message, and it's not at all what's supported. What we know is that a range of health conditions that lead to physical symptoms and pain, that of course that increases stress. That by definition is a stressful life experience, and that it is a very normal response. And the literature ranges that, some, the kind of consensus is that we're looking at 50 to 70% comorbidity between chronic pain conditions and other mood issues. And often people don't know that either, so it's important to communicate that information. Now, when individuals are experiencing pain, it often results in two things happening. One is physical tension, becoming more shallow, heart rate increasing, blood pressure increasing, which is what we do when we go into a fight or flight response. And that also increases emotional anxiety, so fear or worry about what's going to happen, how you're going to feel the rest of the day, how bad the pain will get. And these two things make the pain experience worse. So again, a very natural response to get physically tense and emotionally anxious, but the physical tension itself then exacerbates the pain experience, right? And you end up getting this snowball effect. So what you're working on is teaching individuals to both target, often just through relaxation techniques, the physical tension part of what happens when they're in higher levels of pain, and then also the emotional anxiety piece. And these are figures that I've taken out of Positive Coping with Health Conditions, and you can go into that book and read more about this. You then are in a role as a coach, kind of giving assistance to individuals as they work through CBT-oriented kind of steps for chronic pain. So I've put a link here to Positive Coping with Health Conditions. It's written at a grade 8 reading level. Unfortunately, it isn't translated into other languages. There's a download of the manual. You can also view all of the sections on an HTML, in an HTML format. And there's a relaxation audio. It's an MP3 file that can be downloaded, and I'll get patients to download and save it. I'll say copy it to your computer, put it on your iPod, iPad, and listen to it. And so it's the voice. It was one of the co-authors that goes through and is leading a relaxation exercise. Some people hate hearing a voice telling them what to do. So, I mean, you want to just feel that out and see if they like it. Others love having someone actually kind of walking through and telling them what to do. So it's not that, I mean, I don't force this on people, but if they want to learn relaxation techniques and find it helpful to actually have a voice leading them through it, this the relaxation MP3 file is great, and it's free. You can download, there's links that are on my website, so if you go to, I think it's individual resources, I've got links to this and then a number of other resources, and everything that I've linked is free and evidence-based. If you're working with a patient on supporting their self-management, you are, first of all, explaining what self-management is, right? So giving a short little overview on what self-management is. You're encouraging them to use written resources. And then your role is to provide ongoing assistance and really help them. So as they're kind of struggling as they go through the steps. And when you think about areas to start with, there's really, I see kind of three main kinds of presentations of patients. There's the patient who's really become really inactive and socially isolated. There's the patients that are feeling really overwhelmed and just kind of unable to cope with situations, and the ones that are kind of overly negative, and there may be anger that's involved here. And what I've done here is just listed the sections of the workbook that I find most helpful to start with, given the patient presentation that you're seeing. There are three main CBT skills that are effective and also presented in this book. So one is behavioral activation, and that really is, I mean, like it sounds, getting behaviorally activated, doing more when it comes to physical activity and social activity. There's a number of skills that relate to realistic thinking, related to worry, depression, and anger, and then problem solving, because often individuals feel like life is in chaos and they get very overwhelmed with life situations. So the explanation for behavioral activation is, what we know is that being inactive behaviorally leads to mood becoming low and also leads to pain symptoms becoming worse. And really what happens is individuals aren't pushing themselves enough to be able to learn that certain activities may not be dangerous. And the more deconditioned you get, the more likely usual activities will start to lead to pain. That kind of makes sense. You get this real negative kind of downward spiral. And the areas to focus on are social contact, because that's often so restricted, self-care, and then just kind of positive, enjoyable activities. Again, these are all areas that really, really suffer. And, you know, what we know is that you can have someone that's in pain, and again, just think of situations or times, and because this is really true for all of us. And imagine pain feels high, and the urge may be to say, well, you know, I'm not going to go out and visit with the friend that I was going to see because I won't be able to sit and I'm in so much pain. Now, and that may be very valid, right? That's how an individual may be feeling, but we know that when you actually do what it is that you're worried about doing, often, inevitably people will say they feel somewhat better, or it didn't feel worse. And the reason is that we get a lot of positive impact on our emotions from just simply connecting with people. It also serves a distraction component, and one of the biggest things with pain is individuals will put an over-focus and become hyper-vigilant to scanning their body, and doing activities that are enjoyable or social, by definition, makes you distract. Realistic thinking, again, I've just got a couple slides here that I'll finish up and then take some questions, but we know that there's often very negative, distorted thinking patterns that come along with pain, which leads to, again, mood becoming low, and when mood is low, pain feels worse. So there's a number of effective strategies. We know that one of the things to do is identify the kind of distorted thinking patterns that come along with pain, you know, the catastrophic thoughts, the probability overestimation, and then really getting individuals to challenge those thoughts and really testing them out to say, okay, are these valid? Are they accurate? Is it inaccurate statements to say, you know, I'll never be able to have a normal social life again, right? That kind of statement is catastrophic and not helpful, and really creates more distress and does more harm than good. And then what I'll do is challenge people. And I'll say, okay, is that really accurate? Can we rephrase that statement in a way where it actually is more accurate? And there's a number of kind of strategies that are presented in Positive Coping with Health Conditions. It goes through and has a real systematic way to ask these questions. And the final is problem solving. I mean, often when individuals are dealing with chronic pain, they're so, life has just become really overwhelming, and, they just kind of feel like everything's in chaos, everything's disorganized, and then feel really stuck and not know where to start with moving forward. So really working on building skills to start to problem solve other life issues can indirectly lead to relief of, not relief, it can lead to some improvements with pain. And again, really, people may say, okay, so how, this isn't even related to the pain issue, but the reality is, again, for any of us, just think even when you're feeling well, if the rest of your life feels like it's in chaos, you're more tense, you're more stressed, you're not going to sleep in the same way. And if you're feeling physically healthy, most of us can usually tolerate that for short periods of time. But if you are already dealing with a chronic pain condition, those things actually make pain worse. So if it's the problem solving of other issues that's impacting your sleep even worse, and you already have sleep problems because of your pain, you're creating this kind of snowball effect and can work on at least reducing the other kind of noise that's contributing to those symptoms. Yeah, and I'll stop there and see if there's any questions. I don't know how, will I be able to hear people, Tanya?
So people aren't able to talk, but please, everyone, feel free to go ahead and submit questions through the question box that you have on your panel. and that would be great. There was one early in the session that was, how do you effectively utilize positive coping strategies when your disability prevents you from doing what you want, such as working or maintaining a social life?
Okay, so how do you do these things when sorry, can you just say the question again?
Sure. How do you utilize positive coping strategies when your disability prevents you from doing what you want, like working or maintaining a social life?
Yeah, I mean, and so if I'm understanding kind of I think what the question is, behind that is saying that the symptoms are so great that basic activities aren't able to be done. I think that's the kind of intent behind the question, and if it is, I mean, I'd say you just start small, right? And that's what's really important, is that being on disability, and as I mentioned earlier, this population that I worked with was exclusively a disability population and a chronic disability population, and individuals got better. It doesn't happen overnight. It's really important to be realistic in your expectations, and I'll say over-scheduling is just as bad as under-scheduling, right? So you don't want to overdo, but you also don't want to underdo, and the goal is to start to say, okay, what are the areas that are most distressing? Start with one or two of those and start small and gradually build yourself up.
So Tanya, shall I jump in here?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. This is Anne speaking, and we had some very positive feedback comments, Jody, and there is a question here if there are any suggestions for presenting this education to patients, to a group of patients.
Yeah, I think that this is great information to provide to patients. So is the question whether you...
on how to, I think, if there's a model or just the way it's set up, I guess, that you've described it, or is there, if you have a group of patients, I think is the question, and you're not doing one-on-one counseling.
Yeah, this kind of content for sure can be done. I've run groups in this area, like kind of psychoeducational groups, really, and it's taking these same messages, right? I mean, obviously what I put together here it's not directly intended for a patient population, but it's the same information. When I present this to patients, it's the same content that I'm giving. I mean, you take a different slant on it, but certainly you can build information or groups around the core CBT skills.
And would you recommend using maybe the Positive Coping with Health Conditions workbooklet as a base for starting one of those groups for someone who is interested in doing that?
Yeah, I think that's excellent, and people again can feel free to use. I mean, all we ask is that there's appropriate acknowledgement is given, but the whole spirit in actually developing that resource was something like this didn't exist in the public domain. It was to create something that's evidence-based that anyone could use. So, yeah, people absolutely can use it. It's a bit broader. It was written when we were asked by Vancouver Council to do this. It was written for individuals with a range of health conditions, so it's been generic because of that, but all of the sections apply to someone with pain. There's one dedicated one on pain, anger, worry, so people can pull different parts that they think would be useful out of that and adapt as they see fit.
Okay. There is a question about what activities would you define as being medically contraindicated?
That really depends on the patient. So, yeah, it would depend. And, I'd probably say 99% of the patients that I see with chronic pain, there's no medically contraindicated activities. Really, medically, so the harm piece, right? Now, it doesn't mean that things don't create pain. And you got to appreciate, as a psychologist, I'm seeing a skewed population, right? So I'm not going to see the ones that have conditions where pain is a big part of it. So there is a little bit of a filter there. So I don't want think I'm saying like 99% of patients can do anything. But it depends on the condition. But when you think of chronic pain, like, I mean, let's say chronic headaches is a good example. Chronic migraines, nothing's medically contraindicated. There's nothing you can actually do that's going to harm you. You might feel unbearable amounts of pain, but it's not medically contraindicated. So having a migraine, and I'll qualify that a bit, because if it's to the point that, you know, you're so distracted or so focused on pain, you know, doing certain things like driving a vehicle probably isn't a good idea. But if, you know, someone said, you know, I've got a chronic migraine and I can't go to the gym, well, it's not a can't issue. It feels worse, but I've never seen anyone where that's been a medical contraindication. The same is true for chronic fatigue syndrome, where there's often comorbid pain, and fibromyalgia. By definition, those are two conditions where there isn't evidence of other physical pathology or disease process. So physical activity is not ever contraindicated for those patients. Yeah, so I'll kind of leave it at that. But, you know, for individuals that do have a concern, you do want to make sure, and you do want to check it out with their, you know, with usually the family doc or whoever's a primary physical health provider, but ask that question to say, you know, what can the patient not do? And then often the response I would get is, well, you know, X, Y, and Z creates pain. And I would say, but is it creating physical harm? So make sure you ask that question.
Good point. Now, you're mentioning the SS, what is it, the self-management.
Yeah.
So do you usually work into the CBT approach if the other is not successful?
Yeah, so really, I mean, supported self-management is using a CBT approach. Yeah, so to think of the supported self-management, I mean, that's not the piece that I need to describe to patients. It's just, this was for providers to say this is what you're kind of doing to provide a frame for that. But what the heart of the approach is to say, okay, you get a self-management tool like positive coping with health conditions. You teach patients to implement that, and then you're acting as a coach. So that really is what the self-management, supported self-management approach looks like. But it's using CBT.
Tanya, do you see any others that I'm missing?
I was just going to do a quick, there were two different questions, but they're very similar, about pushing through the exhaustion, like if you have chronic fatigue syndrome, or with fibro also there's kind of like what's called the brain fog, you know, like the foggy inability to fully reason sometimes, and how to kind of push through that to still keep your activities up, and you're, you know, still being engaged even though there's so much fatigue often associated with it.
Yeah.
And so it's just what about kind of pushing through that.
Yeah, and go slow and steady is usually what I'll suggest. So because what I'll find is what patients often do is they will either completely underdo, right? So doing way less, and that's leading to deconditioning. Or the other mistake that they'll make is overdo. So if they could have a day that feels good, they'll do way more than what they normally would do, and then rebound pain actually truly is higher. So what I'll say is pacing becomes really important. So pacing, gradual, consistent activity. And usually what I'll do with a baseline is I'll ask, you know, people to start with what they can do. So I'll ask, how long can you sit for? How long can you stand for? How long can you walk for? How long can you go to the gym for? How long can you socialize with friends? Like all the areas that I'm feeling I need information on. And then what I'll do is, if someone says, well, I can't do it all the time, but I can sometimes go for a half-hour walk. I'll say, okay, so I'll take that as a baseline, and then I cut it in half. And I say, okay, so what I want you to do is do 15-minute walks only, because you can do half an hour, but the rule is you got to do those more consistently. So I may say, you do it every day or every other day, but I'm starting lower than what they're already able to do, but just making it consistent.
Very good. That's very good advice.
Mm-hmm. I see one earlier question here, whether this program's been evaluated recently in an RCT.
Yeah, so this is, it's not a program that I'm talking about. It's a resource. So the book itself has not been validated, but there's lots of literature if you look at cognitive behavioral approaches in pain that have taken adopt randomized control trials as their approach. So if you go to PubMed and do a lit search on CBT pain, you'll find lots of literature. So all of this is based on evidence-based approaches and principles.
Right. And somebody's mentioning here, there are a few people are mentioning resources as well, and I'm not sure some of these may actually be in your book. There's a peer-to-peer CBT support group available, and we'll have the website. It's recoverycanada.org, and there's 4 groups apparently in the peer-to-peer support groups in the Lower Mainland.
Oh, that's great to know. I didn't know about that actually.
Yeah.
So Recovery Canada. Because I'm always looking.
Recovery Canada, and there's another one, lowselfhelpsystems.org. That's the telephone and chat meetings.
Oh, great.
Yeah, so that's a good resource. Thank you to Diane for that.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's great because I'm always looking for things that are good to just link on my site for patients.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Okay.
The other ones that were mentioned, and I'll just mention them real quick because I promote them all the time, is Arthritis Society and the University of Victoria Center on Aging. Both do self-management programs that are really fantastic for chronic pain, as well as I think they have an arthritis-specific one and a fibromyalgia-specific one. So just to throw that out as resources as well. And we'll do a blog post with all of these links and resources for people that have been discussed so that everybody has access to them.
Great, thank you.
And I think that's it. Anne, anything else that you see?
I'm just scanning through all the questions. The only one is, can people use this approach if they don't have any formal training?
Yeah, and so I teach supportive self-management kind of approaches to do a lot actually with family docs and non-mental health care providers. The goal is to not put yourself out as being, trained in CBT at all, right? It's the same way, think about, it's the same way that you would encourage compliance with medications. Same and different, but similar in that way. So, if someone's prescribing medications, that works, right? Or let's say a physician has said, well, this is what's recommended. And if the individual is struggling with compliance, the role can become to say, okay, let's make sure you stay on track and what's getting in the way of you not doing that. Very similar for this, where you're giving the resources to the patient. You're saying it's your responsibility to carry through, and all I'm going to do is kind of support you as you go through that and see what gets in the way. So just being mindful of not saying you're doing CBT, that you're specializing it at all. So that's why I talk about like being a support and a coach.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really valuable way of looking at it for a lot of healthcare providers. I think a lot of people feel they have to have the answer, and really a lot of the times the patients can direct that and the providers to the answers. So I don't see any other questions, Tanya. So.
All right, then I think we'll go ahead and wrap up. Thank you so much, Jodi. That was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you for having me.
Wonderful. Thank you for being here. And thank you very much for everyone who attended, and we will hopefully see you at our next webinar. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.